in this episode of the Critical Oxygen Podcast.
And it's like, how far are you on this sickness to wellness? And what I'm realizing for just people that are doing it for overall general well-being, like the closer they are to sickness, the more of an impact that they're noticing on the EWOT.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Critical Oxygen Podcast, where we help you optimize your physiology and maximize your athletic potential. I'm your host, Phil Batterson, and today we're joined by continuing guest host, Andy St. Germain, where we're going to be talking about exercise with oxygen therapy. Andy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Phil. Excited to be here like always.
Yeah, so something I've been seeing on Andy's Instagram quite often lately is him wearing this crazy mask hooked up to a bike, and he's just, going balls out. I don't know if that's appropriate to say on the podcast, but he's going all out on the bike. And it's one of those things where we were talking last night about, what should we talk about on the podcast? And he was like, what about EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy? And I was like, dude, I'm not really familiar with what that is. So I did a little bit of, kind of looking up online today, but I'm going to kind of defer to Andy to explain to us what EWOT is, and then kind of how he's using it to develop different aspects of his physiology and how he thinks it fits best into CrossFit. So Andy, if you want to kind of take it away, just give us like a brief introduction of what EWOT is and, maybe how you're using it right now. And then we can kind of keep that conversation rolling from there.
Cool. Yeah. So EWOT is just the abbreviation for obviously exercise with oxygen therapy. So the air that we breathe is about 21% O2, and then the rest is nitrogen or whatever other chemicals or components that are in the air. So the air we breathe isn't really rich in oxygen. What the EWOT does is the EWOT is a oxygen concentrator. So it allows, it's really two separate devices. The EWOT bag is what's filled up from the concentrator. And the concentrator purifies oxygen to 98 to 99% purity levels.
Wow.
So basically we fill up the bag, and then from the bag, we put the mask on, and then we go through, traditionally it's zone 2 cardio. But I've been playing around more with doing some high intensity intervals with it. And the cool thing, so, there's two main ways that I look at the EWOT. There's a big piece is just overall health and well-being. And oxygen can help with inflammation, with sleep. There's a whole host of benefits depending on, what's going on with the body and how oxygen can aid to bring the body back to health. And that's one of the big ways that we use it here at Central Health, is just supplementing people to living a healthier lifestyle. But I've also started to dive into the EWOT from a performance lens. And I have the Moxie, the muscle oxygen sensor, where I've been connecting that to people and running different sorts of training ideas and running them through and just kind of monitoring and tracking what's going on with the actual oxygen within the person's system. So from like a health perspective, outside of performance, personally, I've noticed huge improvements with my sleep and my overall energy levels. Inflammation, also, I've noticed a reduction in just like full body inflammation, but that's also tricky because inflammation isn't necessarily bad. And that's one thing I'm starting to dive into now is like, there's oxidative stress. Like you can have too much oxygen and that can actually cause problems as well. So I think that's kind of where I'm playing the lines and trying to figure out exactly like how much is, because if you look online, it's like, they're like, hey, as long as you're doing 15 minutes a day, you can do it every single day. But again, that's online. And I think online misses a lot of context, and there's a lot of other variables that can come into play. So generally, like from just a health perspective, I'm putting people on it for 15 minutes and just letting them ride at the traditional zone 2 cardio pace. So around like 60 to 70% of their max heart rate is what I'm using to track that. And then the performance stuff is some of the new stuff I've been seeing and really been fascinated by. And I think there's a lot of there's still a lot more stuff that I'm gonna have to dive into to fully know like what is the best. But I had someone on it last week, and I had them do 15 minutes on the EWOT before they went and did their capacity session. And the overarching trend that I saw with the reading on the Moxie was his SMO2 continued to climb and climb and climb and climb and climb throughout the whole aerobic piece.
Nice.
Which there's like, you know, generally what I see, and this is what makes it tough, is there's so many variables that are dependent on what SMO2 is. Like, how was their warm up? What is their, you know, what did the training look like the day before? So there's a lot of variables that can affect what SMO2 looks like. But generally, when I put someone through a good warm up, their system's prepped, and then we go into some aerobic work, the SMO2 will stay high, but there's this natural trend of it trending down over the 30 to 60 minutes. And through running the EWOT, it was the exact opposite. Like, you know, it was going up. So it was really cool to see because, you know, as people are doing aerobic work, their tissue will start to get fatigued, the respiratory system starts to get fatigued, and there's just overall general fatigue in the system. So what the system's able to do over time is going to decrease. Right. So it was really interesting to see how this person really, from a physiological standpoint, they were like increasing as the intervals went on, or as the capacity piece went on. So I think there's a lot of value and a lot of opportunity to use this just for like true recovery days. Like what I find, especially in the CrossFit space, is they'll have active recovery days, but they're not really recovery days. They're still just days where they're stressing themselves. So I think this puts a whole new lens on, hey, what can we actually do from a physiological standpoint while someone's still moving and quote unquote exercising. And then on top of that, you know, and the thing that really got me fascinated with it was just the personal experience that I had when I got on it. And it's just with anything, like, you're not going to know. It's like you got to accumulate time with it and let it build up. But just the huge things that I've noticed are just my sleep and energy are just substantially different. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I wonder how much of that. So we always talk about, you and I were talking about trade-offs, right? Like when you add something, there's a trade-off for whatever it is. And with increased oxygen levels, I wonder if it's less stress on the system, right? Less bioenergetic stress. You're not relying on, you know, carbohydrate metabolism or non-aerobic metabolism as much. So then you are essentially causing less overall stress during the exercise. So you're actually able to, you know, recover more. And then that recovery, you know, like the benefits to recovery then is then helping your sleep because you're not stressing your system as much. And then you're feeling better in terms of energy. So maybe it's a good way of getting those people who have a tendency to even go too hard during their easy days to still allow them to kind of go a little bit harder than what you would really like them to do as a coach, but allow them to recover in the process and then facilitate more recovery further on. So then when they do come back to, you know, doing their hard workouts, they can actually do them harder in a sense.
Yeah. And I love that way that you're looking at it. Cause the next thing I want to do is I want to start thinking of like, what could be the possibilities and what could be the increase in performance or power output or whatever it is that we're training if I'm doing this consistently pre-workout before hard sessions. Like how much will that allow someone to be able to push and perform better, having all of that, all those benefits from the EWOT?
I would love to see like just an anecdotal trial of you doing like a warm up without EWOT and then doing, you know, like a 4x4 minute, you know, VO2 max workout or something like that. And then I'd love to see one with the EWOT warm up and see how that changes your performance. And then I would love to see you do that with a warm up and with the EWOT in between, like during your rest sessions or like rest portions, and then see like, you know, what, like everything that changes. Because, you know, if the faster, from a bioenergetic standpoint, if we're thinking about it from that, and that's kind of where I'm leaning, is like, if we get adequate oxygen almost immediately because we're hypersaturating our tissues with you know, oxygen that's 99 or 98%, or air that's 98 or 99% oxygen, then that would allow for you to switch from kind of those non-aerobic stores to those aerobic restorative bioenergetics a little bit faster. And then you'd probably be able to recover faster. You'd probably be able to then, you know, resynthesize more of your phosphocreatine during the 3 or 4 minute session. And then you'd be able to have higher power output for longer. So yeah, dude, that's actually pretty cool. I'd seen it. So now that I think about it, I think I've seen EWOT used by a guy named Ben Greenfield. If you've heard of him. Yeah. You know, he's always on these, like, you know, kind of like trends.
Yeah.
It was like 4 or 5 years ago that I saw him actually like doing this, and he was pushing it really hard. And I can't remember what the outcome was, but I saw him talking about it a long time ago, and I wonder, you know, what his overall experience was with it. You know, was he just getting paid by the companies that made these, you know, to push it a little bit more, or was he truly seeing benefits? And then on top of it, if you are giving yourself better performance, what's the trade-off? Because you're going harder, but the internal stress might be a little bit lower. It's the same thing like when we see people take large doses of vitamin C and vitamin E immediately pre or post exercise, it actually blunts the exercise response, because you're not getting those signals. You're not getting those exercise adaptation signals for as long. And, you know, then you're not adapting quite to the same extent. It's not like you take vitamin C or vitamin E and you don't get any adaptations. You just get less adaptations. Right. But then if we start talking about consistency and specificity, I guess from a consistency standpoint, it could keep you more consistent because you're recovering better. You might not be stressing the system quite as much, but you're getting that higher power output more often or more effectively. So it's like more quality workout. Yeah, my brain is just rolling now because I'm just like, oh man, this is like, it has some potential for it.
I would love to hear any feedback, you know, outside of this on just like what, because that's where my mind has so many different ways and the of what we can track and how we can go about it. And right now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to have the individual that ran through the original test, I'm going to have him run through it, but do EWOT afterwards. So that way I'll be able to see what happens to the system when he didn't do EWOT beforehand and have a comparison for before and after. And then also just seeing like, hey, post-workout, I mean, I have an idea. His SMO2 is probably going to get super high. Another thing I found what was really cool, so I'll have people do, I'll have people go hypoxic before training, just to help hydrate their tissue with more O2. Drop the O2 that's within their blood system to get to the tissue more. So
how do you do that?
So there's a couple different ways that I do it. One, so I have a device called the Spiro Tiger, and you can use, it's real easy to do with the Spiro Tiger, but I also can do it without just normal breathing, but I'll use the Spiro Tiger just to help warm up the respiratory system in general. But just having, depending on people's fitness level and where they are, some people just breathing normal on the Spiro Tiger will turn them hypoxic. But then people who are super fit, it won't turn them hypoxic, but I can start to adjust things to get them there. So generally it's holding the exhale for 4 to 6 seconds or just a longer exhale. And that's one thing I noticed was I had somebody do, I had him do the EWOT, and I had him do some of the other treatments that we have up here at Central Health. We did like the PEMF, he even did some red light. And then I had him go in the sauna, and in the sauna, I was having him go hypoxic. And he wasn't able to get there. He couldn't do it. And before, like if he was out just normal in his normal training session, he's able to get there. But because of how much O2 was circulating through his system, it was just impossible for him to get to that 70 to generally where I put people is, sorry, not 70, 90 to 94% O2. I'll
Okay.
put him on
Yep.
a oximeter and kind of track it. And he was not able to get below 90, 95. Um,
I I'm it's interesting you're talking about this because I was sent a Breathe Way Better device, which is just a bag, right? And then you do different breathing cadences and all of that, and then you monitor your arterial oxygen saturation using the pulse oximeter, like you were talking about. And during those slow breaths, man, I would get down to like 89%. Like I was like, I would get real low. And at that point, then you're like, you start to feel that trigger, to actually like want to breathe more and all of that. So it's interesting that you're kind of getting them hypoxic first, maybe priming the tissue a little bit more. So then when you give them the excess oxygen, it's like hyper saturating.
yes.
And I wonder to what extent, because for the most part, right, when we're just living everyday life, we have adequate oxygen, right? Our arterial blood oxygen saturation is 97 to 99% generally. So I wonder, like, maybe because of changes in oxygen saturation within the blood or other things like that, we protect how much oxygen is bound to our red blood cells first. But then when we get more oxygen on top of that, then we say, oh, well, we can offload a little bit more at the tissue. So then our muscle oxygenation starts to go up. So it's interesting. And I know we get a little bit of dissolved oxygen within the blood, but it's hardly any. So I'm just interested. I'm just curious in terms of like the mechanisms of action for actually hypersaturating the tissue. And maybe it's just a simple bioenergetic thing. Maybe from the standpoint of your muscles, you can just maintain muscle oxygen tension a little bit better by reloading myoglobin even better. And then you can maintain your SMO2 even higher. And then by maintaining your myoglobin levels, you can have more oxygen available for your mitochondria to essentially pull off, change the water and use it for energy, ATP resynthesis. So yeah, that's where my brain's going. It's like, man, this is super interesting. And I know you're doing it from like a truly applied perspective, and you've done it right in some of your training.
Yep.
And you were saying like you typically use it for zone 2. Do you wear like a heart rate monitor either?
I
like,
generally will put a heart rate monitor on, and then just to give me a track. And then now, I mean, I was doing that in the beginning, always putting the heart rate monitor on. But now with the C2 bikes and as the timer there, like I'll just check my pulse with my hand. I'll just be riding. I'll get 15 seconds and then times it by 4 and see where I'm at. And I'll hang like 120 to 130 beats per minute. But again, that's where it's like, and why the Moxie is such a great tool is because just because I'm at that 120 or 30 doesn't necessarily mean I'm like completely in zone 2 because of what's happening, what type of muscle contractions are happening are at play as well.
Right.
So, but generally I'll have some way to track heart rate just to make sure that, I'm not, it can be easy on that, especially for people who are new with it. It's like they have this mask on. It's a little bit like more challenging to breathe. I find for some people, it's like I have to kind of push them. It's like, hey, you gotta go a little bit faster here.
Do you notice if your heart rate, like, do you try to keep your heart rate the same? And if so, do you notice that your power output's higher then? Like, is your performance better? Or do you notice lower power output or lower heart rate, excuse me, for the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer, I don't know. And I think that would be another good way to test it is because I'm not really looking. Yeah, when I get on there, I'm not paying too close attention to power output. And I'm not using it a whole lot right now for me personally, from a performance standpoint. I'm using it more just for a health standpoint. So usually I get in and I'm just tracking the heart rate. But that would be interesting to see, like, hey, what is happening with the wattage with where my heart rate's at when I'm on the
Hmm.
EWOT, and then when I'm also not on the EWOT. I think that would definitely be some cool stuff to look into.
Yeah. And I know there's tons of research out there that's actually, that's looked at. It's called hyperbaric hyperoxygenation. So essentially you're in a
Mm,
room and you're under higher pressure. So it basically pushes you have higher oxygen tension in the
mhm,
air. So it
mhm.
pushes more oxygen to your muscles. Whereas this is hyper concentrating the amount of oxygen that's within the air. So again, it's creating a higher partial pressure of oxygen within the air that's then diffusing it
Mhm,
better
mhm.
to your mitochondria.
Yeah,
Um,
that's one.
it's really it's
Yeah,
interesting.
and that's
Yeah.
one thing that a lot of the stuff that I've looked up online, they're really just comparing the two, like hyperbaric chamber and EWOT. And the big advantage, they're saying that they definitely have differences, but they're very, very similar. And the advantage of the EWOT is just a time constraint, because I've never done a hyperbaric chamber, but I think you're in there for like an hour or so. Um,
Yeah, and I think you have to like dial up the pressure because like you can't have the doors being open and
okay.
closed, right? So you have to like be in there, you have to dial up the pressure, and then you finally get the hyperoxygenation that you would be
Mhm.
wanting. Whereas with this, right, if you're preparing it for somebody, you just flip on the switch and then it fills up your Douglas bag, and then by the time they're done with their warm up and stuff like that, they just get on the bike, put the mask on, and away
Yep.
they go.
Yep.
So yeah, that's man, dude, there's so many things that I'm like, this sort of stuff sounds super interesting. And from a recovery standpoint, right? I think one of the big things in CrossFit is the ability to recover. And it I don't know if this plays into the ability to recover, but it gives you a better ability to recover because it's hyper oxygenating the
Mhm,
tissue.
mhm,
It's most likely getting more like if you have, let's think about this from an energetic standpoint. If you have more oxygen within the tissue, then you're able to use more oxygen to synthesize
mhm,
ATP.
mhm,
That's most likely what's
mhm,
going to happen. So you'll be less reliant on things like phosphocreatine and glucose
mhm,
breakdown, like glycogen and blood
mhm.
glucose. If you're less reliant on those, then you can spare those for longer, which we know with higher intensity
Yeah.
exercise, those sort
Mhm,
of stores go
mhm,
down. So, perhaps that's one of the ways again that you're feeling better is you're sparing that. Man, what
mhm,
I want is I want somebody to do like hyperbaric oxygen but also be able to measure like how much CO2 and
mhm,
oxygen you're breaking
mhm,
down so you can get like how much fat and how much
mhm,
carbohydrate, because I have an idea that this, at your zone
mhm.
2 you could potentially be oxidizing more fat for the same,
Okay.
heart rate or
Uh-huh.
power output, just because you have more oxygen
Yeah.
available. But then at the same time, I'm like, well, does having more oxygen available really push, that towards fat oxidation,
Mhm,
or does it really not
mhm,
matter? Like, are your mitochondria already
mhm,
optimally working? Like,
mhm.
that's the,
Yeah, and
that's what
that's where
I
I'm
wrestle
wanting
with.
to dive into it more, because I have a very enthusiastic personality, and when I find something I really like it, and I've just been on the EWOT
Hmm.
nonstop, and part of me is I'm wondering, I'm
Yeah.
like what is the payout, like, because again, like we talked about from assessment, I really believe that everything in life, you can do something positive, but there's going to be a negative consequence on the other end. So that
Hmm.
is the one thing where I've got on there and I question, like, how much is too much, and can you be using this to a place where it's like becomes detrimental or harmful to somebody's health? But I think, again, from like
Hmm.
a health standpoint, I think it just depends on where you are. CrossFit talks a lot about this sickness to wellness spectrum. And it's like, how far are you
Hmm.
on this sickness to wellness? And what I'm realizing for just people that are doing it for overall general well-being, like the closer they are to sickness, the more of an impact that they're noticing on the EWOT. Versus the healthier people
Hmm.
come in, they're not noticing as big of an impact. So I think that taking that into
Yes.
consideration is always going to be important when I'm deciding who to prescribe this to. But as far as from the performance stance, I think it's a no-brainer to have it on recovery days. Like if you're just trying to do like a just low intensity recovery day, and then post workout just to help your system recover. And using it in those two ways,
Yeah.
I think could be so valuable. And then outside of that, I think there's opportunity of doing like, hey, especially as the season gets closer towards competition season and the high intensity stuff becomes more valuable. It's like, what happens when we throw you through some high intensity intervals and then on your rest, you're on the EWOT? Because a lot of the stuff says about 3 minutes. And then the EWOT's like, it's kicking and it's already doing stuff within your system from a physiological stance. So it's like, hey, you have 5 intervals where we're doing max effort sprints. It's like, 20 cals on the rower, 20 chest to bar, 10 burpees over the rower. And then you're resting 3 minutes, but you're on the EWOT, just going really slow, breathing in the O2, and you're going back and forth for your 5 rounds. I think that there's a lot of positive stuff that could happen with that.
Yeah, I think it would certainly keep the quality of the workout really high. So if you have an individual who has a tendency to, kind of fall off as they go because they don't know how to pace themselves, or they just don't have that recovery ability quite yet that you would hope for, then it could show them that they do have the ability to do it. They just need to maybe breathe better, have more effective or efficient, movement. And that's something. So there's 2 things that I wanted to touch on in terms of say the CrossFit games, right? Everybody was blown away when Matt Fraser was like, oh, I'm eating candy bars and I shit my bed to the CrossFit games and I eat a lot of carbohydrates and stuff like that. And it showed time and time again that, his ability to recover over the course of, 5 days of competition was higher than everybody else's, because his performance kind of stayed the same, whereas everybody else's, they would start up here and then end, super low. So I wonder if that's one of those things like where you take this hyperoxic generator to an event. Nobody else do this. This is Andy's thing.
Because this is like a really good. I think this is where it could really excel.
Yeah,
it's like having it at a competition.
I think.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you're one of the few people lucky enough to listen to this part of the podcast, maybe, using something like EWOT would be valuable for that post recovery, more so than, just jumping in like an ice bath, or more so than, doing a heat or something like that, because the faster you can get out of that, the faster you can get rid of that post-exercise oxygen deficit, the faster you can start recovering things. So, you saw Roman Krennikov, right? After every single workout, he was eating a banana. He was doing something like that. It's like carbohydrates, and then, or perhaps first, you just like chug a Gatorade when you get off the competition floor, and then get right to your EWOT stuff and do 20 minutes easy. And, there you go. You're already hyperoxygenating the tissues and recovering.
Yeah. And dude, that makes me like, I almost feel like we should look in, and there's like, if there's not a ban to this already, because I'm not very familiar with, I know the whole, I'm familiar with cycling a little bit, but the blood doping is what was huge in cycling.
Right.
And it wasn't necessarily, people think it was taking steroids, but it's not like, that was a piece of it. But the blood doping is actually, from my understanding, is you're just exchanging the blood within your system. You're actually putting more blood into your system, so you have more red blood cells, so you can carry more oxygen to your tissue. So it's almost like, this is like, if someone were to have like an event and they had the 30-minute row, or 60-minute row for distance, and you did 15 minutes on the EWOT beforehand, and then went and did the row, it's like, that almost feels like there's like this crossover with blood doping.
Well, so I can expand on that a little bit. So what is banned, from my understanding, is so what blood doping is you would take, during the off season or something, you'd take out your blood, you'd put it in like a blood bag, freeze it down, and you would make sure you would get rid of all the plasma. So you'd essentially just have red blood cells. And then when you get to a competition, then you'd re-inject that into your bloodstream. So then you would have more, like you were saying, more hemoglobin, more carrying capacity. And, that's what's illegal. But what isn't illegal is sleeping in like an altitude tent, which has been shown to stimulate hemoglobin. Doing other things that you manipulate the altitude, or like heat training isn't illegal, and that has been shown to increase, total hemoglobin as well. So go ahead.
Go into that. So heat training. So what specifically, like, is that really where some of the, because I've noticed from a personal standpoint, and I've come across a lot of contradicting information around, like, can a sauna really replicate zone two cardio? And I think from, that's what makes it challenging is there's a lot of things that come into play. There's the heart, there's the muscles, there's the mental aspect. And I'm like, what makes zone two? But I've always felt that from again, I don't have anything to say like, hey, here's my data proving it. This is just, again, a personal experience. That zone, or that sitting in the sauna, really does allow me to not necessarily progress my zone two, but I can do no zone two for a while and then but my sauna sessions stay consistent and I feel good. I can just tell a difference. So is that because of the heat adaptation and what that's doing to the hemoglobin, or would you think that's more because of what's actually happening with the heart? Because in the sauna, my heart rate, it still gets up to 120 to 140 beats per minute. So
oh man, that's so tough, because part of me says, your body only adapts to whatever the stress that you're putting it under, and getting warm you'll get better at cooling yourself, right? That's the adaptation, right? You'll have to shunt more blood to your skin in order to sweat more, in order to, try to increase cooling capacity. So maybe from that perspective, by, not doing zone two, but then switching to sauna, you're maintaining higher plasma volume, which then when you get back to your zone two stuff allows you to cool by pushing blood to your skin, but also get enough, oxygen to your working muscle. Whereas what I'm talking about with heat training, so you need to do what's been shown in the literature lately is that if you do extended periods of heat training where you're doing like an hour of zone two work with like a parka and sweatpants and all of this sort of stuff on, kind of like wrestling, right? Like, when you go to the wrestling room, but not to lose weight. The goal is not to lose weight. It's just to get yourself really hot. If you do that for at least 5 weeks, you actually they've been showing that you get increases in hemoglobin, with the idea that the first adaptations that happen are increases in plasma. Increases in plasma help you stay cool. But then because that plasma volume is so increased, the hypothesis is that it makes your hemoglobin levels relative, your hematocrit levels, seem relatively low, which then would stimulate EPO, which is erythropoietin, which is the hormone that stimulates red blood cell count. And by, having extended periods of heat training, you can then increase your hemoglobin amount. It's kind of still up in the air, like if it actually gives you performance benefits and other things like that. But it's another way of increasing your hemoglobin, which would increase oxygen carrying capacity. Because at the end of the day, that's pretty much what's limiting most of us, is how much oxygen we can carry, because that's how much oxygen we'll be able to extract, so on and so forth. So, back to the whole EWOT thing. I think that depending on how long those benefits of doing, a 15-minute warm up with EWOT would last, like if you have a 15-minute workout and the benefits of that last 15 minutes, then it's like, okay, get off the work, like do the workout, get off like the bike, and then go do your warm up, get off the bike, and then go do your workout. And if you have 15 minutes, then you might have 15 minutes worth of benefit, right? Then you get right back off, and then you go back and you do it again. But I want to caution people, because with increased oxygen, you could get increased reactive oxygen species, which could then damage tissue, because that is a signaling molecule for damage. But the difference between an acute bout and a pathophysiological amount of this is that you have like a slow drip. Like when you have individuals with excess adipose tissue who are sick with chronic inflammation, with all of this sort of stuff, it's kind of like a slow drip of free radicals, or reactive oxygen species, whatever you want to call them, that then cause damage within the cell that then can't be repaired. Whereas with this, the idea would be is that since it's such an acute bout, 15-20 minutes maybe, it's a spike and then it goes down, and then your body has time to repair afterwards.
Okay.
So as long as you're not going over, that threshold of accumulating free, reactive oxygen species damage. I don't know why it's so hard for me to say those right now, but as long as you're not going over kind of that stress point, then that's probably one of like the main benefits, because it's stimulating your body to react to it and then repair and then, go from there. So yeah. Go ahead.
I don't know if this is going to be, I don't know if there'd be a way to like accurately be able to measure this because of, unless we were actually like able to take samples of people's actual muscle tissue. But when we talked about the assessment, I kind of broke down people being more type 1 versus type 2 and what that has to do with people's performance. And I do wonder what kind of effect, because generally type 2 is just going to be, isn't going to be able to utilize oxygen as well and as efficiently as type 1. So it's like, what can this actually start to change people's muscle tissue makeup by having more O2? Is that going to force them to start being more type 1? I don't know. I don't think I have enough information or to be able to say like yes or no. But I think that because again, the way I look at things is every system affects one another. We have really 11 organ systems, and each one affects the other system. So if we're affecting one thing by bringing in higher concentrations of oxygen, yes, we're having more oxygen in the body, but that's going to affect other systems within the body as well. Right. And that's one thing I've thought about, is because I'm really big on respiratory training for people. And another thing I've thought of, like, hey, maybe this, what is the payoff is like, what does this actually do to the respiratory system? Because if your body's signaling like, hey, I got plenty of oxygen, is that just naturally going to reduce the way your respiratory system's working and could actually then negatively impact the way the respiratory system works? So as far as like what it does to the type of tissue we have, and then what it does to the respiratory system, are two things where I would love to dive in a little bit deeper to figure out, just to make sure it's being utilized in the most conducive way.
Yeah, I don't think the research is kind of out there yet, right? For those long-term studies, like is using EWOT for every workout, detrimental to the benefits, right? But I would say if it follows the same sort of pattern as most things that seem beneficial, right? Like vitamin C and E, your antioxidants and stuff. If you quell those reactive oxygen species, like we were talking, super fast, then perhaps you're not going to get as much benefit. But in the short term, right, if you just use it kind of like here and there sparingly, or if you're trying to pursue performance like what we're talking about and you're doing hard stuff every single day, it's more important for you to be consistent and have a lower response to the training than it is to have a higher response and then get sick and not be consistent, right? So it's a trade-off. It's maybe you're slowing down your progress, but you'd be able to, put some awesome numbers to it, and maybe your performance is going to be better acutely, but then you're just not going to be adapting quite as well. But I always say, if somebody is working out really hard, then you're not going to run into an issue of lack of adaptation, because you're going to be able to continue to push harder and harder and harder and harder as long as you are adapting. So from my perspective, I'm like, yeah, give it a shot. I'm interested to see, and we'll continue to check back with you, Andy, on how things are progressing with that. I don't have one, or else I would probably be trying to use it a little bit. But yeah, I think that's a really good primer on exercise with oxygen therapy. I think as Andy and I kind of think about it more and talk a little bit more offline about it and see where he goes, we can come up with responses and subsequent episodes and everything like that. But I think we'll stop right there for now. You can find me at Critical02 on Instagram. Shoot me a DM if you have any questions about this sort of stuff. You can find Andy at Instagram at Andy St. Germain. It's Germain. And if you guys have any questions, like I said, either leave them in the comments down below or reach out to us on Instagram. All right. See you, everybody.